She sent me to the garage. Just like that, as casually as asking someone to pass the salt. Karen, could you sleep downstairs tonight? That way, we won't disturb the boy, she said, not looking at me, while she closed the dishwasher. The boy, by the way, sleeps with earplugs and a stuffed animal the size of a washing machine. But of course, I'm the problem. I didn't answer. I nodded, grabbed my tiger blanket, the one I bought 20 years ago at the discount shop and that, according to her, causes allergies, and went down the stairs with all the dignity one can muster when your knees are rusty and your soul is on fire. The only thing I took, besides the blanket, were the keys. Hers. Down there, it smelled of old gasoline, damp, and that sour mix of hot rubber and dust you get in places where nobody lives. They only store what's in the way. I suppose that's why she sent me there, because in that house, I was in the way. The floor was freezing. I sat on a folding chair by the car and laughed to myself. Not a happy laugh, no. That dry laugh that comes when there's nothing else left to do. Upstairs, I heard the door slam, then silence. And a few seconds later, my son's voice, Julian, with his same little voice as always. Mom, don't pay attention to her, she's nervous. Don't worry, son, I said. I'm perfectly fine. I learned to sleep in the cold years ago. He didn't answer. I only heard him go up the stairs, slowly, as if the floor could rat him out. That's how it all began. That night, while the wind came in through the cracks and the fluorescent light flickered, I thought that sometimes people don't insult you with words, but with gestures, with decisions, with closed doors. And I promised myself that was going to be the last time anyone treated me like a piece of furniture in a housecoat. I tucked myself in with the blanket, turned on my phone's flashlight, and opened one of the old boxes by the car. Inside, I found my old nurse's bag. I hadn't touched it since I retired, more than 15 years ago. There it was, my blood pressure cuff, my stethoscope, adhesive tape, a small pair of scissors, and, at the bottom, my old keychain. 2 keys identical to the ones for the upstairs flat. I looked at them. They shone. And in that moment, I swear, I didn't think of revenge. I thought of dignity, of how, at my age, life doesn't give you many chances to recover lost respect. And that's when I felt something inside light up slowly, like an old heater coming back to life after years switched off. That warmth didn't come from the body. It came from pride. The pride one keeps for when the time comes to use it as a weapon. But before I go on telling you what happened that night, because what happened changed everything, I'm very curious to know from where in the world and at what time you're joining me today to listen. I'd truly love to read you in the comments, because sometimes I think stories like mine repeat themselves everywhere. Only the names and the garages change. Anyway, that night, while I listened to the meters tick-tock and the slow drip of the boiler, I realized something. Lucy, my daughter-in-law, thought she'd kicked me out, but she didn't know she had sent me right to the place where I had everything I needed to remind her who I am. I closed my eyes and thought, tomorrow, when it dawns, this house is going to learn some manners. And with that phrase in my head, I fell asleep. Calm, with the keys clenched in my fist. When I woke up, the garage air smelled like metal and something close to rancor. I'd slept with the blanket up to my nose, and still my fingers were numb. My knees hurt, my back, my soul, but I also had a clarity in my head I hadn't felt in a long time. I don't know if it was age, or exhaustion, or that calm that shows up when you're tired of keeping quiet. I got up slowly, folded the blanket with almost military precision, and as I did I thought that at that exact moment, upstairs, Lucy must be pouring herself the first coffee of the day, the one she always clinks with the spoon against the cup as if marking territory. I imagined her face, serene, without remorse, and mine reflected in the spoon, with purple under eyes and the crazy hair I get when I don't wash it. A low, bitter laugh escaped me, but a laugh nonetheless. Dignity sometimes begins by laughing at yourself. I went up the stairs carefully. I didn't want to wake anyone, nor give them the pleasure of seeing me tremble. I reached the kitchen. She was standing with her back to me, in a white robe and a tight bun, that bun that looks like an order. My son wasn't there. He'd have already left for work, as always, escaping difficult conversations. She looked at me sideways. "Sleep well?" she asked, toneless, like a log. "The car snores less than your husband," I said, pouring myself tap water. She said nothing, not even a huff. And that silence hurt me more than any word. Because when someone doesn't even bother to argue with you anymore, it means they've decided to erase you. Watching her move between the coffee maker and the toaster, I understood this wasn't the first time someone tried to make me small. For years at the hospital, I had bosses who yelled at me in front of everyone, patients who treated me like a maid, and colleagues who stabbed me in shifts. I learned to smile, to fake calm, to give an injection without my hand shaking even when my blood boiled inside. I suppose that habit of swallowing came from far back, from when my mother told me that decent women endure, that patience is a virtue. But I'm no longer the age for being virtuous, nor do I feel like it. I went out with my coat half on and my hair a mess. The baker greeted me, like every morning. "How's everything, Karen?" "Perfect," I said. "I sleep in the garage, but I don't pay rent." He laughed, thinking it was a joke. If only he knew. I bought bread, milk, and some of those cookies that Lucy considers vulgar. I came back slowly, breathing the cold air, watching dogs walk their owners. Everyone seemed happy. I was too, once. When Julian was little and he did everything with me, when he asked me to tell him bedtime stories and I invented tales about astronauts and ghosts who washed dishes. Then he grew up, got married, and the world shrank. You don't realize the size of love until it no longer fits anywhere. When I got back, I found her cleaning the countertop with her usual obsession. That woman doesn't clean, she exercises. I handed her the bread. I bought wholemeal, like you like. "Thanks, Karen, but we already have some. No problem. We can freeze it." I smiled. "It's not good to fill the freezer. It uses more electricity," she replied. Every sentence with her was a chess match. I moved a piece, she boxed me in. But the worst part was that my son didn't see it. Not because he didn't want to, but because he never learned how to look. Since he was little, Julian has been the type who believes that if you don't talk about the problem doesn't exist. And that's how it's gone for him. Sometimes I think men are raised to run away and women to endure the running. I put the keys in my coat pocket. I felt them heavy, cold, metallic. They weren't a secret, they were a possibility. I had no idea what I was going to do. I only knew I wasn't going to stay still. After breakfast, I went down to the garage again, not out of resignation, but strategy. That place that last night felt like a sentence was starting to feel like my base. I checked the boxes. Tools, old papers, a fan that no longer works, photos from the summer of '84 when my husband was still alive. In one of those photos, it's the three of us, him, my son and me, feet in the river, laughing like life would never end. I slipped the photo into my pocket. Like having proof that I once existed. Meanwhile, I heard footsteps upstairs. Lucy was on the phone, her haughty voice echoing between the walls. She said my name several times. I don't know what to do with her. She's a good woman, but she's old. My house isn't a nursing home. I don't know if she said it for me or for someone else, but I didn't care. By then, humiliation slid off me like water off a windshield. I stayed downstairs a while longer, thinking. A woman can endure a lot, but there's a point where patience turns into anger. And anger, well used, is a clean energy. It doesn't destroy, it puts things in order. I didn't want to hurt anyone. I wanted to restore balance, like in the hospital when an IV goes off balance. Nobody notices the adjustment, but without it, the body collapses. When I went up again, she had already left for work. The house was silent, with that smell of disinfectant and old coffee. I went into my room the room that was mine, and saw she'd changed the sheets for new ones, gray, cold, impersonal. Mine, the floral ones, were folded in a bag by the hamper. She didn't say anything, but the message was clear. This is no longer yours. I sat on the bed and, for the first time in a long time, I cried. But not that loud sobbing from the movies. I cried without making a sound, holding my breath, as if afraid the crying would break more than the silence. And when I finished, I felt a strange lightness, as if the crying had cleaned the inner floor where she had stomped so much. In the afternoon, my son arrived. He saw me calm and cheered up. Poor thing, always so naive. How are you, Mom? Very well, son. I slept like a queen. Lucy felt bad about last night. Don't worry, kingdoms always have small wars. He laughed, without understanding. I hugged him, and as I did, I knew I wouldn't blame him anymore. That all my energy, my memory, my sleepless nights would focus on something else, regaining respect without asking permission. That night, I went down to the garage by choice. I wanted to observe, measure the space, know the terrain. A nurse learns to look before acting. I saw the breaker panel, the access to the patio, the stairs to the bedrooms. Everything has a logic, a structure. Houses aren't so different from bodies. If you know where the veins are, you can control circulation. I turned on a small radio I found in a box and stayed listening to old songs. The kind that smell of cheap cologne and Sunday afternoons. I put on my wool gloves and mentally reviewed every corner of the flat. I thought about night shifts, about patients who slipped out of bed, about hallways that smelled of bleach and hope. I've always considered myself good at keeping calm, and now I was going to need it. Because I knew the war wasn't over. Lucy had kept the last word, but I had the keys. And with keys, darling, you can open many things. Before going to bed, I looked at the ceiling, right under their bedroom. I heard laughter, then silence. I thought life might boil down to that. Some sleep peacefully because they believe others won't move. And others, the ones who've already lost everything, start moving precisely because they've got nothing to lose. I closed my eyes. In the dark, the car cooling made a noise like a clock ticking down. And I swear that, for the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid. Only a quiet, round certainty. The next time that woman tried to lock me in, she'd be the one who couldn't get out. The third night was different. There was electricity in the air, a tension that didn't come from the cold or exhaustion, but from that feeling that settles in when you start to stop obeying. The body still pretends to be still, but inside everything has already moved. I went down to the garage early, with the excuse of looking for some boxes. In reality, I wanted to be alone. Upstairs, Lucy talked on the phone, gave orders, laughed with that dry laugh that has no joy, only arrogance. I heard her walking around the house in heels, each step marking territory like a cat in heat. I no longer felt anger. I felt a kind of cool curiosity. I wanted to understand how far a person could go when convinced power is naturally theirs. I sat by the car and watched the fluorescent light tremble on the ceiling. Funny, when you spend a lot of time in a place that isn't yours, you end up owning the smallest details. The hum of the tube, the drip of the tap, the creak of the beams. Those noises become yours, and through them, the house starts talking to you. I don't know if they were memories or hunches, but I felt that garage, so cold and forgotten, was telling me things I'd missed. Where the outlets are, where the current comes in, which switch controls which light. In hospitals, I learned not to underestimate noises. Sometimes, the smallest sound announces a catastrophe or a salvation. That night, purely on instinct, I opened the breaker panel. The labels were written in blue marker: kitchen, living room, bathroom, hallway. I didn't touch anything. I just memorized them. I closed the cover slowly. Knowing how electricity runs through a house is like knowing its nervous system. I did it with no specific plan, or so I told myself. But deep down, I already knew all learning is a seed. Sooner or later, it sprouts. I went up the stairs slowly, barefoot, with the keys in my pocket. I didn't want to make noise, only listen. From the hallway, you could hear the murmur of the TV, the warm air slipping under the door. I went close enough to smell her perfume, that sickly sweet scent that always made me nauseous. I stood there for a few seconds, listening to the silence between her breaths. I thought I'd never seen her sleep, and that maybe if I looked now, I'd understand something about her way of being. But I didn't dare turn the knob. Dignity doesn't need proofs, I told myself. I went back to the garage and started tidying up, not out of cleanliness, but because I needed to do something with my hands. In a box, I found an old flashlight with no batteries. In another, almost a full roll of duct tape, the silvery kind we used at the hospital to improvise bandages or secure cables. I also found a rubber door wedge. I held it a while between my fingers. The minimal weight of that object made me think about how little it sometimes takes to change the direction of things. You don't have to shout or break anything, you just have to push at the right moment. While I organized, I remembered a shift when an aggressive patient tried to run out of the ward. We didn't have locks that locked from the outside, so I improvised a system with a wooden wedge and adhesive tape. That was enough to keep the door blocked until security arrived. Nobody got hurt. It was, let's say, temporary containment. That night at the hospital, I thought that sometimes containing is also a way of caring, a hard way, yes, but necessary. Lucy wasn't a patient, but her arrogance had something of an illness, and her contempt was starting to infect everything. So, while I put the wedge in a box next to the duct tape, I understood maybe my work wasn't finished yet. Perhaps life had brought me back to the garage to remind me I still knew how to do what I'd always done: keep calm while everyone else loses theirs. At midnight, I heard footsteps in the hallway. My son. He stopped in front of the garage door, hesitating. I didn't move. I heard him press his forehead to the wood. "Mom, I'm sorry," he murmured. I didn't answer. There are apologies that, if you answer too quickly, dissolve. I let silence do its job. After a while, he left. I knew he'd keep sleeping uneasily, torn between two loyalties he wouldn't know how to reconcile. Poor Julian. Not every man can handle a woman who doesn't need him, and now he had two. I sat again by the car. I closed my eyes. I started reciting, like a prayer, the house's sounds, the click of the hallway clock, the slight vibration of the boiler, the creak of wood when the temperature changes. And suddenly, I heard something different, a dry, metallic sound from above. I kept still. Another thump. It was a window slamming shut. Then, quick steps. Then, nothing. I laughed. Even the noise in that house seemed to want to run away. I didn't sleep. I devoted myself to thinking. Not about revenge. Not exactly. I thought about how to restore respect without harm. In the hospital, when an aggressive patient spits at you, you don't hit back. You speak in a firm voice, look them in the eye, and remind them of their name. That throws them off. It humanizes them. With Lucy, I would do something similar, but in the language she understood: control. I was going to remind her that keys don't always open doors. Sometimes they close them. At 3 a.m, I went up again. The house slept. My steps were measured. On the landing, I saw a sliver of light slipping in from the hallway window. A bluish, cold light, almost like an operating room. I went to her door. The paint was clean, the knob shiny. I left my hand on the metal a few seconds, feeling my own pulse. Then I took the duct tape and the wedge out of my pocket. I wasn't going to use them yet. I just wanted to measure, to study. I placed the tape along the frame and checked how much space there was between the door and the floor. A few millimeters, just enough. Enough. I put everything away. I went down again. In the kitchen, the fridge hummed like an insect. I poured a glass of water and looked at my reflection in the window. I didn't quite recognize myself. There was a strange calm in my eyes, as if I were watching something inevitable approach, and it didn't scare me. It wasn't hatred I felt. It was something deeper, the need for things to regain a natural order. You can't live in a house where roles are reversed, and the grandmother sleeps with the tires. The house itself starts to get sick. I lay down for a while on the garage sofa. The blanket smelled of my old perfume, that jasmine no one makes anymore. Outside it rained. The drops hit the metal door with a rhythm like a heartbeat. I thought that if someone saw me from the outside, they'd say I'm a poor, deranged woman. But no, I'm not. I'm lucid, more than ever. Lucidity has a bad reputation because it scares people. When you see things clearly, you stop asking permission, and that makes you dangerous. Around 5:30, the sky began to lighten. The garage filled with a gray glow. I got up, smoothed the blanket, and went to the breaker panel again. I didn't touch anything, I just made a small mark with a marker on the switch for the hallway. A tiny gesture, almost invisible. The kind of gesture only someone in absolute calm can make. I went up one last time before dawn. From the landing I listened to their breathing upstairs. A soft snore, then another. Everything in order. I closed my eyes, leaned my forehead on the wall, and felt the cold plaster on my skin. I didn't think about plans or punishments. I only repeated a phrase, almost a sigh. Houses speak, and I've already learned their language. Then I went down, wrapped myself in the blanket, and waited for daybreak, knowing the next day would bring something new, something that had already started moving quietly, like an underground current that, sooner or later, finds an outlet. At 6:30, I couldn't stand lying down any longer. I felt as if the air inside the garage had turned too dense, as if the walls were breathing too. I got up and opened the garage door a bit so the dawn light could come in. The floor was damp, the street lights still flickered. Outside smelled of freshly baked bread, diesel, a city starting another day without knowing what's coming. I stood watching the streetlight's reflection on the car and thought the garage wasn't just a punishment, it was a lab. From there I could watch them without being seen, think without interruptions, feel again that I had control over something. And that, at my age, is worth more than affection. I went up to the kitchen when the sun was barely peeking, moving in silence so as not to wake them. I turned the coffee maker on slowly, filled the thermos, and sat by the window. Outside, the garbage truck went by, the same guys as always who wave, wheels squealing. In that moment I knew I had stopped being afraid. Not of physical fear, that left me years ago, but fear of contempt, of being forgotten, of becoming someone's shadow. Because that's what Lucy was trying. To dissolve my existence into the background of her perfect order, without noise, without smell, without space. But there's no way to erase completely someone who remembers. And I remembered every gesture, every phrase said with that fake sweetness that hurts more than a shout. At 8, I heard the bedroom door open. Her steps down the hallway, the exact routine. Bathroom, hairdryer, heels, the radio with news. She watched me from the threshold as if I shouldn't be there. "Did you sleep downstairs again?" she asked. "Yes. I like the silence." "Suit yourself," she answered, and poured her coffee without looking at me. She told me about a shopping list, that she'd be late, that the boy needed something for school. I nodded in silence. When she finished, she left her cup in the sink with a hard clink and left, leaving behind her expensive perfume and a draft that came in through the door. As soon as I heard the elevator click, I stayed still a moment, listening to the silence she'd left behind. It was a new silence, full of possibilities. I took out of a box some rubber gloves, a rag, a small screwdriver, and the rubber wedge I'd found the night before. I wasn't thinking of doing harm, I was thinking of precision. My whole life was that, precision. In the hospital, a poorly placed needle could cause a hemorrhage, a miscalculation, a cardiac arrest. Your hands had to move slowly, without trembling, with awareness. Now, every move I made in that house had that same clinical pulse. I inspected the hallway door. The frame was good, the hinges new, but it had a slight play that allowed the wedge to fit from the outside if you knew how. I tried once, without force, just to feel the pressure. It worked. It made no noise. It was as if the air itself held the door. I sat on the floor beside it and breathed deep. The plan wasn't clear in my head yet, but something in me knew it was a matter of time. Important decisions are never thought out. You recognize them when they arrive. I went back to the garage and opened the bag. Everything was still in order inside. The pressure cuff, the tape, the scissors. I touched each object like someone stroking memories. I didn't feel cruel, I felt awake. Maybe that's what Lucy couldn't stand about me, that I saw her, that I didn't swallow her act. People who live pretending need an audience. When the audience stops applauding, they get scared. And I'd stepped out of her show. Late morning, Julian came downstairs. He looked tired, phone in hand. "Mom," Lucy says, "can you air out the garage a bit? It smells stale." "Tell her it's family air," I answered. He looked at me with a weak smile, as if asking me not to keep going. "Don't make things harder," he said. "I'm not making them harder, son. I'm just making them visible." He lowered his gaze and left. I listened to his steps until they faded on the stairs. Then, for the first time in days, I turned the music up on my phone. An old song from when we still danced in the living room after dinner. I started cleaning the garage, but I was really preparing it. Everything in its place, boxes stacked, the bag on the metal table, the sound of the rag on the metal, the music in the background, the echo of my own steps, gave me a sense of order I hadn't felt in a long time. And as I moved things, I thought that everything I'd learned about caring could also serve to defend myself. Because in the end, caring is foreseeing, getting ahead of the wound. By late afternoon, the sky filled with heavy clouds. It smelled like a storm. I went up with my cup of tea and looked down the hallway. Lucy was in the living room on a video call. She gestured, laughed loudly. She talked about a dinner, a promotion at work. When she saw me, she lowered her voice. "What are you doing standing there?" she asked. "Nothing. Seeing if it'll rain." "No need to look at me like that." "Like what?" "Like you know something." "Maybe I know more than it seems," I said, and I went to the garage without waiting for an answer. I went down with a steady heart. The rain began to beat on the door. Each drop sounded like a second erased from the clock. I thought about everything I'd endured since I arrived. The hints, the laughs, the ever smaller space they left me. And I thought that at some point, life makes you choose. Keep being invisible or remind the world you're still breathing. I chose to breathe. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed sitting by the car, flashlight on, looking at the door that led to the hallway. In the dim light, the wedge glinted a little. I touched it with my fingertips. I felt a deep calm, the same one I felt when I decided to change a patient's IV, knowing that small gesture would make their night better. I didn't yet know what would happen, but I did know that when morning came, something inside that house would move. Not with shouting or blows, but with that silent firmness only women tired of keeping quiet can have. The garage smelled of damp, but also of determination. I listened to the wind outside, thunder in the distance, rain running down the gutters like slow applause. I thought of my mother, how she said storms clean. Maybe she was right. Maybe that house needed a good storm, and I was the only one who knew how to unleash it without breaking anything. I closed my eyes, breathed deep, and let the sound of water carry me, imagining the dawn, the gray light through the windows, the first noise of the coffee maker. And in the calm that precedes inevitable acts, I caught myself smiling, not from happiness, but from understanding. Because I finally realized it wasn't revenge moving me, but the need to be seen as something more than a shadow. There's no greater punishment for those who humiliate than forcing them to look. When I opened my eyes, the clock read 5:15. I stood, stretched my back, took the flashlight, and climbed the first steps. Upstairs, everything slept. Each step was a pulse, each breath a beat. I stopped in front of her door, looked at it a long time and, without thinking, placed my palm on the wood. I felt the warmth on the other side. I kept my hand there until my heartbeat became one with the silence. Then I went back down, turned off the flashlight, and waited for dawn, certain that the house had finally started to listen to me. When morning broke, the air had that milky color storms leave behind, and the silence was so perfect that for a moment I thought I'd gone deaf. I went up slowly, coffee in hand, and each step creaked as if the wood knew that day wouldn't be like the others. The hallway clock struck 7 on the dot. The house smelled of damp and detergent, a mix that always seemed sad to me, like houses where cleanliness is used to cover guilt. I set the cup on the counter and stood still. Nothing could be heard upstairs. No hairdryer, no Lucy's footsteps, no wardrobe doors, just the tick-tock of the clock. It seemed odd, but I didn't move. Then I heard the first thud. Dull, short, like a fist against wood. Then another, and another. I went up slowly, unhurried. Halfway up, the voice. "Julian, the door's jammed, I can't get out!" I kept still. A dense silence filled the hallway, followed by the sound of the handle turning, insistent, desperate. I opened the bathroom door and looked at myself in the mirror. My hair was tousled, my eyes puffy, but there was something new in my expression. Calm. The kind of calm that comes when the world finally starts to understand you. "What's wrong, Lucy?" I asked from the hallway, feigning surprise. "The door won't open. It's stuck." "Did you try lifting up while you turn it?" I said, approaching slowly. "Of course I did. Help me." "I'm coming," I answered, but I didn't move right away. I glanced at the knob, trembling with each of her attempts. I turned it very gently, just to feel the resistance. It was firm, shut. Perfect. I leaned toward the crack and felt the warm air coming from the bedroom. Her voice was on the verge of tears. "I don't understand. It closed fine last night." "Calm down," I said. "Sometimes wood swells with humidity." I went to the kitchen and reheated the coffee. While the steam rose, I listened to her keep knocking. She wasn't shouting anymore. She was whimpering, like a frightened child. The noise was almost hypnotic. I poured another cup, added a little sugar, and went up, slowly, until I stood in front of the door. "Does anything hurt?" I asked. "No, but I need to get out. I have a meeting." "Well, doors don't understand meetings. Breathe." The knob turned again, without success. Behind me, Julian appeared, half asleep, shirt unbuttoned. "What's going on?" he said. "Looks like the door's stuck," I replied. "How is it going to get stuck? Old houses have character. You know that." He came close, shoved with his shoulder, tried again. Nothing. Lucy on the other side was tapping more softly now, as if afraid of breaking something. "Julian, help me, I can't open it." "Easy, I'll call the locksmith." No, I'll be late." "It's fine. No one dies from missing a day," I said, sipping my coffee. He looked at me, confused. "I suppose." He noticed my voice sounded too calm, but he said nothing. "I'll get tools," he muttered, heading down to the garage. The hallway went quiet, only her breathing behind the door, and mine, slower, steadier. I leaned and pressed my forehead to the wood. "Lucy," I whispered, "breathe. No one's going to leave you in there." "I don't know what happened," she said, and her voice cracked a bit. "I just closed the door, like always. Of course, like always." I went down the stairs slowly. In the kitchen, the clock struck 8. Outside, the sun filtered through the clouds, and the air had that smell of wet earth that took me back to summers when I was a girl. I sat by the window, listening to my son's nervous footsteps in the background. I heard him opening drawers, cursing, going up and down. He still didn't understand there are things you can't fix with tools. When he came back, he had a screwdriver in his hand. "It won't fit. It's jammed completely." Then, "Wait for the locksmith," I said. "And what do we do in the meantime?" "We drink coffee." He looked at me for a moment, with the face of someone beginning to suspect the world isn't as simple as he thought. I felt sorry for him, but also proud. I had raised a good man, if a little blind. It wasn't his fault. Sometimes kindness is also a way of not seeing. At 8:30, the phone rang. It was Lucy's office, I suppose. Julian answered, spoke softly, and hung up without a word. Then he went to the door and told her the locksmith would take about 40 minutes. She didn't answer, only a sigh. "Want me to bring her some water?" I asked. "Yes, please." I filled a glass and left it on the floor, by the crack. "There you go, dear," I said. The glass disappeared slowly. "Thank you," she murmured. The sound of the glass scraping the wood gave me a kind of tenderness. I don't know if it was tenderness or pity, maybe a mix. I turned the radio up to mask the tension. The news talked about an accident on the highway, a politician resigning, bread prices going up. Everything in the world carried on, and that felt reassuring. At 8:45, the door was still shut. Julian had sat on the sofa, head in his hands. "I don't understand how this could happen," he said. "Houses, son. Sometimes defend themselves, I replied. He didn't look at me, but I know he heard. In his silence, there was something like understanding, or at least a sense that what was happening wasn't a simple accident. And even so, he said nothing, because when truth starts to peek out, the easiest thing is to stay still and let it fade. A few minutes later, the locksmith arrived. A young man with a toolbox on his shoulder and a face like he'd slept little. He said hello, examined the frame, the knob, the screws. "It's not broken," he said. "It's like blocked from the outside." "Blocked?" Julian repeated. "Yeah, it's odd, like someone immobilized it without locking it." I took a sip of coffee and looked at him. "Strange, isn't it?" I said. The locksmith nodded, uncomfortable. "I'll try to open it without breaking anything." He knelt, took out some small tools, and while he worked, the house filled with a soft buzz, metal on metal. Julian paced, anxious, not knowing where to put his hands. I stayed standing, watching. Not out of cruelty, but because there are scenes you need to record in your memory to understand that balance, at last, has been restored. After a while, the locksmith sighed. "It's going to take a bit. It's very firm." "No rush," I said. Lucy, inside, didn't respond. Only the sound of her breathing, slower and more tired each time. I stayed there, motionless, cup in my hands, watching the morning light filter through the curtains. For the first time in a long time, I felt everything was in its place. Not perfect, but in its place. The door closed, the sun learning to look, the house breathing new air. I didn't feel guilt. I felt balance. And while the locksmith kept trying, I realized something that made me smile unintentionally. Justice, when it arrives late, always smells like freshly brewed coffee. The metal on metal tapping became constant, a fine clatter mixed with the murmur of the rain still falling outside. The locksmith huffed, turned the screwdriver, tried a thin shim, and stopped now and then to study the frame as if he expected the door to give him a clue. Julian stood next to him, breath quick, staring at the knob as if he could open it with the force of his eyes. I stayed at the end of the hallway, holding coffee gone cold, watching in silence. The whole house seemed to hold its breath, like hospitals do right before bad news. The phone rang again. Julian answered, spoke in a low voice, and hung up clumsily. Then he looked at me, lost. "It was her boss," he said, "wanted to know if she was okay." "Tell him yes," I answered, "she's resting." The locksmith glanced up for a second, hesitating, but said nothing. He seemed uncomfortable, as if he sensed there was something he shouldn't comment on. A few minutes later, the neighbor from 4B showed up. Mrs. Dorothy, a petite woman with gray hair in a bun and a determined air I liked from day one. She'd been a firefighter in her time and still had that blend of authority and curiosity you see in those who've seen too much. "What's going on here?" she asked, looking at Julian, who rushed to explain. "The bedroom door's jammed. We don't know how. Let me see." She crouched by the locksmith, took a little pick set from her bag, and opened it with a click that sounded almost theatrical. "I know a bit about this," she said, and smiled. Julian stared, surprised, and I took the chance to go closer. "Thanks for coming, Dorothy. I couldn't stay at home with all that banging." "I thought someone was knocking down a wall," she told me softly, while adjusting a tool. I watched her work. Her hands didn't tremble. Every movement had the certainty of someone who spent a life solving emergencies. She reminded me of me, when at the hospital I had to calm chaos with a look or a crisp order. Two old women, each with her method, but the same pulse. I felt a tenderness and a strange sense of quiet complicity. We didn't look at each other much, but both knew we understood what was happening. "Lucy?" Dorothy said, raising her voice. "Yes," the other answered, weakly. "Easy, dear, it's all right. We'll open it in a minute. Breathe." Her voice was soft, maternal, a contrast to the dry sound of tools. Julian paced in the hallway, repeating nonsense. The door, the locksmith, the humidity. He couldn't keep still. I, on the other hand, felt my body serene, almost heavy, as if the air around me had a different density. Dorothy lifted her head and looked at me out of the corner of her eye. "You're sure no one touched anything?" she asked. "Sure," I said, without blinking. She smiled barely, that tiny smile of women who know but don't judge. "Sometimes things jam on their own," she murmured, like leaving a phrase floating between two silences. We went on like that a good while. The locksmith gave up and stepped aside. Dorothy kept trying carefully, sliding the pick, turning, listening. In the pockets of silence, you could hear Lucy moving inside. A step, a sigh, the rustle of clothes. At 9:30, the atmosphere had turned dense. The air smelled of metal, old coffee, and anxiety. Then I decided to step in. "Let me try something," I said to Dorothy. She moved aside without protest. I knelt, ran my hand along the bottom crack, and checked the wedge was still in place. Perfect. I stood slowly, approached the door, and spoke without raising my voice. "Lucy, listen. No one's going to leave you there. Breathe. Karen, I need to get out. Please." "I know, but first calm down. Have a little water if you've any left." I spoke to her like a patient. No reproach, not a word too many. Just instructions. And I felt something inside me fall into place, that all the disorder of the last few days was starting to make sense. Perhaps it wasn't about punishment, but re-education. Sometimes, to learn empathy, you have to taste helplessness. Minutes passed, the tension eased a bit. Julian brought another jug of water, set it on the table. Dorothy turned on her flashlight and checked the frame carefully. I gathered the things in the first aid kit and arranged them again, slowly, as if the simple act of ordering could restore the house's sanity. "What are you doing, Mom?" my son asked. "Preventing. If she gets dizzy or her blood pressure drops, we need this ready." Dorothy watched me with that mix of respect and curiosity only women who've seen much keep. "You were a nurse, right?" she said. 30 years. I learned that sometimes the only thing you can do is keep calm. Lucy, on the other side, didn't speak. I heard a shuffle and then a softer thud. I went closer again. "You okay?" "Yes, just dizzy. Sit on the floor. Close your eyes. Breathe through your nose." I spoke to her like a patient. Not a scolding, not a single extra word. Only instructions. And I felt everything inside me was aligning, that all that chaos of the last few days was falling into place. Maybe it wasn't punishment. It was treatment. Arrogance is an illness too, and the cure begins by recognizing vulnerability. More minutes passed. Julian brought fresh water. Dorothy checked the frame again. I put the kit back in order. At 10 on the dot, the doorbell rang. 2 local police officers were at the door. A neighbor had heard the banging and thought it was a fight. They came in politely, greeted, and asked what was happening. Julian stepped forward, stammering explanations. I stayed aside, watching. One of them, a young man with tired eyes, asked me if anyone was injured. "No, officer. Just a capricious door and a woman in a hurry." "I see," he replied. "Mind if we take a look?" "Of course, but watch the screwdrivers. You might make the damage worse." As they went up, Dorothy brushed my arm and whispered, "Don't worry, Karen. You'll handle it fine." I smiled at her, grateful. In the hallway, the officer spoke through the door, patient tone, like talking to a scared child. The other barely answered. The other officer took notes, looked at the frame, wrote details. One of them remarked the lock was intact. Everything seemed normal, except it wouldn't open. I found it almost poetic, a perfectly healthy door refusing to yield. After a few minutes, they decided to wait for the building's maintenance. The locksmith, exhausted, packed up. The police stayed a bit longer, chatting with Julian in the living room. I made coffee for everyone. I served it in silence, listening to the murmur of voices. Every so often, the sound of the handle turning, the same attempt over and over, and the same mute resistance. The house had changed. I felt it in the air, in the light. For the first time in a long while, my body didn't feel heavy. I stood looking down the hallway, at the shadows on the walls, the edge of the closed door, and I thought that sometimes authority is earned without raising your voice, just by holding steady when everyone else falls apart. And while the police talked, the coffee steamed, and the rain kept falling, I knew that day would mark a before and after, not only for her, for me too. Because I had finally remembered what it felt like to run an emergency without losing my pulse. The officer's murmur faded as the morning went on, and the house returned to that tense silence that precedes resolution. One of them, the younger, spoke on the radio to log there was no danger, and they were waiting for maintenance, then looked back at me with a mix of respect and caution, as if he sensed this wasn't just a domestic incident, but something that had been brewing for a long time within these walls. I offered them more coffee. Hospital habit taught me a shared coffee diffuses suspicion, but they politely declined. When they left, promising to return if needed, I stayed in the hallway, watching the coffee vapor still rise in slow spirals, as if the air wanted to keep the scene alive a little longer. Dorothy was still there, leaning on the wall, arms crossed. She looked at me without words. No need to speak, her gaze said. I know what you're doing, and I don't judge you. Julian was on the sofa, hands in his hair, not knowing whether to feel guilty or grateful. From the other side of the door, Lucy no longer shouted. You only heard slight movements, the creak of the bed, slower breathing. Fear had turned into something like weariness, and in that weariness, surrender hid. I'm going to try something else, Dorothy said after a while, approaching the door with the calm of someone handling explosives. She took a small tool, a flexible plate, and slid it delicately along the edge of the frame. As she did, she spoke without looking at me. Sometimes, you don't have to force, you just have to find the right angle. I nodded, because I knew exactly what she meant. Life is like that too. You push and nothing moves, but when you find the exact point, the slightest pressure changes everything. Julian watched in silence, anxiously. What if we break the door? He asked no one in particular. Breaking is always easier, Dorothy replied. But then you have to live with the splinters. I stared at the knob while she worked. I thought of everything that had happened these last few days, and how every gesture, every word from Lucy had left an invisible mark. It wasn't a single humiliation that brought me here, but a heap of small slights. The cup she hid because it didn't match. The family photo she removed from the shelf. The comment that my cream smelled like grandmother. None hurt on their own, but together they formed a wall. And when you're pushed against a wall, there comes a moment when you push back. Almost there, Dorothy said quietly, and I breathed in as if the house's air weighed. Just then, I heard her inside. She didn't scream or cry. She just said a phrase that ran through me like an echo. I don't understand why this is happening to me. Her voice wasn't angry, it was bewildered, and in that bewilderment there was something childlike, almost vulnerable. For an instant, I felt tempted to open, to end it, to tell her this wasn't revenge, that I only needed her to feel what I'd felt, that mix of vulnerability and shame that forces you to see differently when doors open. But I didn't. I knew it wasn't time yet. Dorothy looked at me sideways, waiting for a sign. Do I keep going? She asked. A bit more, I said, and she obeyed. The metal gave a tiny squeal, then stopped. There was no resistance, but no opening either. It was as if the door itself refused to decide. The neighbor straightened, put her tools away, and wiped her hands with a handkerchief. I can't do more without breaking it, she warned. Sometimes things need to stay jammed a while so people learn not to shut them so hard. Her sentence fell between us with the weight of a truth dressed as a joke. Julian didn't understand it, but I did. She left soon after, leaving me alone with my son. He looked at me, eyes red. I don't know what's happening, Mom. Nothing that shouldn't have happened long ago, I answered. He sighed and leaned against the wall, exhausted. I love her, you know. I know. And that's what keeps you from seeing what she's doing to you. Don't talk like that. I'm not speaking badly, I'm speaking clearly. There's no worse blindness than the kind disguised as love. He went to the living room, sat down, turned on the TV without watching. The minutes stretched. Outside, the sun had already broken through the clouds, but inside the house, time was still stopped. I walked to the kitchen, washed the cups, wiped the counter. Each gesture was a way of reclaiming my place. For the first time in days, the clink of dishes didn't seem like noise to me, but music. It was my house again, even if only for a few hours. Around noon, the building's tech finally arrived. He checked the frame, the knob, and concluded the same as the others. No visible damage. Everything was perfectly in place. Must be swelling from humidity, he said, shrugging. Humidity explains a lot, I answered. It gets into the places no one really cleans. He smiled, not understanding. When he left, silence fell again, denser, more intimate. Julian had gone out to buy bread, leaving the house in a calm you could almost chew. I went to the door and stood in front of it. I touched the frame, felt the cold metal. "Lucy," I said softly, "are you all right?" "Yes," she answered, hoarse. "I'm hungry. I'll bring you something." I went to the kitchen, prepared a tray with a piece of bread, some water, and some cookies. I left it by the crack and waited. Her hand appeared, trembling, and took the food. That hand, which so many times had pointed at me with contempt, was now just a hand seeking sustenance. I didn't feel pleasure seeing it like that, but I did feel a calm I didn't know. Sometimes, to be able to look at someone again without hatred, you have to see them fragile. Almost an hour went by in that strange silence, broken only by the sound of cutlery and the scrape of the glass coming back. I sat on a chair, facing the door, like a nurse on watch, making sure the patient didn't worsen. And in that moment I understood that what I was doing wasn't punishment, it was treatment. Arrogance is an illness too, and the cure starts by recognizing vulnerability. When Julian returned, he brought fresh bread and a more serene expression. He came, close, and touched my shoulder. "I've been thinking," he said. "Maybe we should move to her mother's for a while, until this settles down. Do what you have to do, son. But don't run away before really looking at what you're leaving behind." He nodded, without arguing. By afternoon, the house filled with the smell of toast and damp wood. I stepped onto the balcony. The sky had cleared completely, and the air held a stillness that felt like peace. Behind me, the door remained closed, but it no longer worried me. It didn't need to open yet. Everything in its own time. I poured myself tea and sat by the window, watching the street, the ordinary movement of people who have no idea that on the third floor there's a war that makes no noise. I thought how easy it is to judge from outside, how a story can seem madness or injustice depending on where you listen from. And then I caught myself smiling, without rancor, only with a strange tenderness for all that we were. An old woman tired of keeping quiet, a son learning to look, and a daughter-in-law who, for the first time in her life, was going to have to listen. That night, when the house went dark, I went up the hallway with the flashlight. I touched the door, just once. Inside, her voice sounded low, spent. "Karen, I'm scared." "Fear teaches," I answered. "Tomorrow we'll talk." I went down slowly, without looking back. In the garage, the blanket waited for me, and the smell of metal seemed, for the first time, a smell of rest. I closed my eyes and slept, knowing what had begun as confinement had become, without anyone noticing, a lesson. Because in the end, there's no door more solid than the one that opens from the inside, when shame finally learns how to breathe. I slept deeply that night, like I hadn't for years, and when I opened my eyes, my body still warm under the blanket, I felt something had loosened in the air. An invisible tension that had been squeezing the house's walls since. I moved in with them. I couldn't say if it was the morning light, clearer, or the silence that no longer weighed the same, but I noticed the atmosphere had become lighter, as if the house had finally exhaled after holding its breath for a long time. I got up, turned on the coffee maker, and while the water boiled, I remembered the last sentence she'd said the night before, that almost childlike voice confessing fear, and I understood that, without fully meaning to, I'd gotten what I needed. Not that she asked forgiveness, but that she feel what I had felt. That mix of vulnerability and shame that forces you to look differently when the doors open. I went up with fresh coffee and sat at the hallway table, right in front of the closed door. I didn't hear any noise, not even a movement, and for a moment I thought maybe she'd fallen asleep, or simply didn't want to talk. In any case, the silence no longer felt hostile. It was a silence shaped like a pause, like waiting. I prepared a small breakfast. Toast, a drizzle of olive oil, sugar in a little dish, the aroma filling the hallway. That smell of warm bread brought back old images, winter mornings at the hospital, when we nurses shared a piece of toast before starting rounds. I sat a while watching the steam from the coffee rise, as if it were smoke from a story still burning. At 9, I heard a soft knock inside, just a brush. I went closer, put my ear to the door. "Lucy?" Silence. Then, a sigh. "I'm hungry," she said, hoarse. "I'll bring you something," I answered. I set on the floor a tray with bread, cheese, and a glass of water. The sound of the glass sliding under the crack was so faint it stirred an unexpected tenderness in me, the same I felt with my most difficult patients, the ones who swore they didn't need help, but ended up accepting a sip of water from my hands. While I waited, I remembered how many times I'd done exactly that in the past. Take care of others with no one taking care of me. Maybe that's why the situation felt so familiar, almost professional. Somehow I had returned to my old trade, keeping alive what seemed broken. The sound of the glass coming back pulled me from my thoughts. I picked it up, set it on the table, and felt the air start to move differently. Julian appeared then, jacket on, eyes puffy from lack of sleep. "I'm going to work," he said, trying to sound normal. "I'll be back at noon." "Go on," I answered. "Everything's under control." He nodded and left without another word. I watched him go down the stairs, indecision weighing on his shoulders. Poor son of mine, trapped between two women who don't know how to yield. But that's life. You don't choose the wars, only the battles you're willing to fight. I stayed alone with the house's murmur, with the smell of bread and the traffic echo from afar. Nearly an hour passed before I heard her voice again. "Can I come out now?" she asked from inside, not defiant, more tired. "Not yet," I said. "Wait a little longer." The silence that followed was different from before, resigned, almost calm. I leaned against the wall, closed my eyes, and for a moment felt light, as if everything were exactly where it belonged. Then, I decided to do what I do best when my soul settles: tidy up. I started in the kitchen, put plates away, took out the trash, opened windows to let in new air. The sound of the broom sweeping mixed with the street noise rising from below. Each stroke of the brush was a kind of cleaning inside as well. When I finished, I went back to the hallway. The tray was still on the table, empty, and the crumbs on the cloth looked like a sign, like in old tales where someone leaves a trail so the other can find the way. I laughed to myself. Maybe that was the lesson. Leave crumbs, not wounds. I felt the urge to say something, to break the silence with a phrase that would seal the invisible pact being born between us. But I preferred to wait. Some reconciliations aren't spoken, they're breathed. At noon, Julian returned with 2 grocery bags. He set them on the table and looked at me with a mix of caution and tenderness. "I bought things to make soup," he said. "Your favorite." "Thanks, son. How is she?" "Quiet. Thinking, I suppose. Don't you think we should open?" "Not yet. Sometimes silence heals more than words." I made soup in the big pot I brought from my house before selling it. As I stirred with the spoon, the smell of broth filled the kitchen, an aroma that took me straight to the winters of my childhood, when my mother said broth fixed body and soul. I felt that, in some way, that's exactly what I was doing. Fixing, with soup and a bit of patience, a house that had gone crooked. We ate in silence. Julian kept glancing at the hallway door. "Mom, this can't go on," he said finally. "Don't worry. It'll end when it has to. But there's no but. There are times you can't rush." I cleared the table, washed the dishes, dried them calmly. Then I prepared another tray with a bowl of soup, a piece of bread, and some water. I took it to the hallway. "I'm leaving you food," I said, without raising my voice. She didn't answer. I only heard her drag the plate inside. Julian watched me from the living room door, uneasy. "What if we call the locksmith again? Leave her. She won't die from being shut in for a day." "I don't like this, Mom. I didn't like sleeping in the garage either. But here we are." His eyes watered, and I had to look away not to come undone. Sons can't bear their mother's strength when it turns moral, when it stops being sacrifice and becomes will. The afternoon slowed, the sun slanting through the curtains. An old song played on the radio, one of those melodies that remind you time passes, but not completely. I sat on the hallway chair with a book I didn't read, just to be there, present, waiting. After a while I heard a different movement, soft steps, a rustle, and then her voice. "Karen, yes, I want to come out, I know, but first I need you to say something." "What?" "What you feel." Silence. Long, dense. Then, almost a whisper. "I went too far. I treated you badly. I'm sorry." I stayed still, not answering immediately. Not out of cruelty, but so the words would weigh something, so they wouldn't dissolve like so many other times. When I finally spoke, my voice was steady. "That's good. Now you can rest." I still didn't open. I stayed there, listening to her sit on the floor, to the air grow lighter between us. Outside, the day was beginning to die, and for the first time in a long time, the clock's sound didn't seem a reminder of what's slipping away, but proof there's still time to mend what's broken. That night, after dinner, Julian came over and hugged me, without a word. I felt him tremble a little, as if he suddenly understood the exact weight of things. "Thank you, Mom," he whispered. I didn't ask why. Sometimes a son gives thanks without fully understanding. I hugged him too, feeling his heartbeat against my chest, and I knew that, in some way, the door was starting to open, even if the wedge was still in place. When I went to bed, the tiredness was sweet, not bitter, and before closing my eyes, I thought maybe justice isn't what people imagine, a blow, revenge, a victory. Sometimes justice looks more like a slow gesture, a bowl of soup shared under a closed door. Sometimes it's enough that the other says your name without contempt for the world to suddenly make sense again. It dawned, with sunlight pouring into the hallway, a clean light, without rancor, that revealed dust suspended in the air, floating slowly, as if even the particles had decided to take a break. I got up early, earlier than usual, and while the water for coffee began to boil, I thought this morning had a different tone, a balance that didn't come from outside but from within, from the certainty of having crossed something dark and come out the other side unbroken. Julian was still sleeping, and from the closed room there wasn't a single sound, no rustle, no sigh. There was a silence so deep that at times I was afraid to break it, as if any noise might undo the little that had been built. I served coffee, opened the window, and breathed the cold street air. On the corner the baker unloaded sacks, a dog barked, the city went on, oblivious to everything. I sat facing the door, cup in hand, waiting. I knew she was awake. I sensed it in the way the hallway air barely moved, in how the silence had a faint pulse, like held breath. A few minutes passed until I heard her voice, low, almost a murmur. "Can I come out?" The question didn't sound like a demand, but a request, and in that difference everything that had changed fit. "You can," I said, "but I want you to listen first." She didn't reply. Maybe she feared that if she spoke too much, the words would turn into daggers again. I went to the knob, touched it slowly, and felt the cold metal. It wasn't just a door that separated us. It was everything we'd accumulated in silence over the years. Distrust, pride, that infinite fatigue of pretending cordiality. I took a breath. Sometimes it's not about locking anyone in, Lucy. It's about stopping the noise, forcing silence to do its job. I don't hate you. I'm not even angry. I just needed you to understand that people aren't tossed into the garage when they're in the way. I said it without drama, in an almost flat voice, like repeating a known instruction. From the other side came a long sigh, the sound of a hand on the wood. "I understand," she said, barely. "I really do." And in those two words there was something new, sincerity. At that moment Julian came down, half-dressed, hair disheveled, eyes puffy from not sleeping. He looked at us both, not knowing what to do, with that childlike expression men have when they realize the women in their life have spoken a language they don't understand. "Everything okay?" he asked. "Yes," I answered. "I'll call the locksmith again to open it carefully." "No need," I said. "Leave it to me." I went to the drawer where I kept the tools. I took the small, old latch I'd kept from the storage room, looked at it a moment, and smiled. It wasn't a weapon nor a trap. It was a piece of metal that had done its job and now deserved a rest. I went back to the hallway. "Lucy, step back." I turned the knob, and the sound was so soft it was barely heard, an almost affectionate click. The door yielded without resistance. For a second no one moved. She stood there, pale face, red eyes and clenched hands, but she wasn't the same. Her gaze had changed. No longer arrogance, only exhaustion and a tremor I recognized, the same one I felt that first night in the garage. I said nothing. I stepped aside to give her space. She took one step, then another, and stopped in front of me. For an instant, I thought she'd shout, or cry, or look for some explanation, but all she did was lower her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. "You're welcome," I replied. Julian stepped forward, took her by the shoulders, led her to the living room. I stayed in the hallway, watching the light fall on the open door, as if the sun had been waiting for that moment to come in. I breathed deep. I felt something in my chest unknot. She sat on the sofa, silent, and he knelt in front of her, murmuring things I couldn't catch. I made more coffee, one for each of us, and brought it in silence. It wasn't a gesture of reconciliation. It was an act of sanity. Houses need coffee to survive storms. No one said anything for a long time. Outside, the neighborhood church bells rang 9. Lucy stared at the floor, cupping the mug in her fingers, and in that gesture there was more humanity than in all the words she'd said to me in months. Julian, elbows on his knees, watched her with a mix of pity and relief. I took a sip and stared out the window. She broke the silence. "I don't know what to say," she murmured. "Then don't say anything," I replied. Sometimes silence fixes more than it breaks, and that's what we did. The three of us stayed still, breathing the same air, letting time rearrange itself. It was as if the whole house were listening to us, approving, relaxing its beams. After a while she stood, and without looking at me, began clearing the breakfast dishes. She did it slowly, almost timidly. I wanted to stop her, to say it wasn't necessary, but I kept quiet. It wasn't about service or guilt, but about gesture. Each sound of plate on counter rang like an apology. When she finished, she stood a moment at the sink, looking out the window. "Maybe I should go away for a few days," she said. "Do what you think," I replied, "but do it for calm, not for pride." She nodded. We didn't look at each other again. Late morning she went to shower. I heard the water, the patter on the tiles, the sound of soap falling. And suddenly a strange compassion washed over me, a sweet tiredness. I sat in the armchair, closed my eyes, and let the water's murmur lull me. I felt there was no war anymore, only fatigue and a silent agreement. Each of us had understood what was necessary. Julian came close and touched my shoulder. "Mom, I don't know exactly what happened, but thank you." "Don't thank me," I said. "Sometimes things settle on their own when you give them space." He nodded and stayed by my side, in silence. That gesture, sharing silence, was enough. Later, when the house filled again with the smell of soap and clean laundry, Lucy came out of the bathroom. Her hair was wet, face bare, eyes puffy but calm. She paused a moment in front of me, as if searching for something she didn't know how to name. "I'm going to make lunch," she said simply. "Perfect," I answered. And so it was. She cooked in silence. I helped by slicing bread. Julian set the table. None of us mentioned the night before. There was no need. Everything that needed saying was already in the air, in the way the three of us moved without bumping into each other, with a new respect. We ate together, for the first time in a long while, without tension, without measuring words. After lunch, she washed the dishes and I dried. When she handed me the last glass, our hands touched, and she didn't pull hers away. She glanced at me barely, and smiled, a small, almost shy smile. She wasn't asking forgiveness, but she was giving it. and that was enough. In the afternoon, I was alone. They went out shopping. I poured myself tea, opened the windows, and let the fresh air in. I walked through the house, slowly, looking at every corner, every object in place, and I had the feeling the house was breathing differently, slower, deeper. I went to the garage and found the blanket folded, the bag closed, the boxes tidy. I touched the keys still hanging on the nail. One remained. I left it there as a reminder and a warning. I went back upstairs and sat at the hallway table, evening falling. Outside, children played, neighbors chatted from balconies, the world spun as always. But inside me, something had changed. It wasn't victory. It was peace. Not triumph, but rest. And as the sun died behind the buildings, I understood I hadn't done justice. I had made balance. And sometimes that's enough to keep living. The next afternoon slid by without fuss, with that kind of quiet you don't dare break because you know behind it something that hasn't yet settled is still breathing. I woke from a short nap, wrapped in that golden 5 o'clock light, with the buzz of a fly around the curtain and the distant murmur of cars climbing the hill. I went down to the kitchen and poured a glass of water. The cold glass anchored me in the present, reminded me that, for the first time in a long while, the house wasn't a battlefield. There were no shouts, no whispers, none of that stale air tension leaves behind. Just the wind rattling the blinds, water running through pipes, the echo of normality I'd always thought lost. Julian was in the living room, reading messages with a look of quiet concern, as if suddenly everything he hadn't wanted to see had fallen on him. Lucy, meanwhile, stayed in her room, now with the door open, moving in silence. I saw her go to the bathroom, hair tied, an old t-shirt, no perfume, no makeup, without that rigidity that made her seem marble. She greeted me with a small gesture, barely a nod, and kept going. That greeting was the first crack in the wall, an almost invisible detail that, nevertheless, changed the air. I decided not to say anything. I learned there are gestures you shouldn't trap with words, because if you name them too soon, they break. They dissolve into explanations. I sat on the sofa and turned on the TV, more for company than interest. On screen, a presenter talked about unimportant news, while far away, the hallway clock kept a new rhythm, a slower, more human beat. It was a while before she reappeared. She stopped in the doorway with an expression I couldn't read. "We can talk," she said, not as an order, almost as a plea. "Of course," I replied, lowering the volume. She sat across from me, at the other end of the sofa. Her hands were clasped, knuckles white. "I'm not going to justify myself," she began. "I just want you to understand I was wrong. I thought I could organize this house the way I organize everything else, that if everything was in its place, nothing would break. But I forgot, people aren't furniture or schedules. And you reminded me of that in your own way." She spoke slowly, weighing each word, like someone crossing a minefield. I listened without interrupting. I felt a strange calm, the calm of someone who no longer needs to be right. I want us to hate each other," she went on. "I don't know if we can love each other, but at least I want respect." "Respect isn't asked for," I told her. "It's shown and earned." I know she nodded. "And I know I have to earn it." There was a silence. I looked at her and saw in her eyes something like the weariness of shame, that fatigue that comes when you see yourself for the first time through someone else's eyes. "I won't lie," I said. "I don't forget quickly. But I also don't like living at war. I don't have time for that." She lowered her gaze, breathed deep, and said, "I want to try." "Then we start with basics," I replied. "Don't treat me like a burden again. Don't talk to me like I can't hear you. And if one day you forget, look at your hands." "My hands?" "Yes. Every time you humiliate someone, your hands go cold. The body doesn't lie." She smiled a little, a weak but sincere smile. She held out her hand. I took it. It was warm, and for a moment I felt all the cold of the last months evaporate. It wasn't forgiveness. It was a truce. Julian came in then, saw us together, and his face lit up with relief so big it hurt. He came over, hugged us both. That clumsy, tender hug sealed something words couldn't repair. In that contact, I understood my son wasn't the coward I feared. He was just a man trapped between love and habit, like so many others. And I also understood that a mother's love sometimes consists of pushing firmly until her children learn to stand on their own. We had dinner together that night, the three of us. Nothing solemn. A tortilla, some bread, a bottle of wine that had been forgotten for months. The laughs were small, restrained, but real. At times, the sound of cutlery on plates reminded me of other times, when the house was full and noise meant life. After dinner, Julian went to the study to work, and we stayed alone in the kitchen, tidying up. She washed, I dried. For years, that scene had seemed impossible. Two women in silence sharing a task without tension. Each plate she handed me was an unsaid sentence, an implicit apology, and I, without speaking, accepted it. When we finished, she offered me tea. She made it and set it in front of me, a simple gesture, without looking. We drank in silence, watching the steam rise like peace smoke. "Thank you," she said, without raising her voice. "For the tea, or something else?" "For everything," she answered, and didn't need to explain more. I stood, took the cup to the sink, and looked out the window. The street was calm. The building lights flickered as if the world breathed. I thought of all the times I'd wanted to run away, how many nights I promised myself I wouldn't be invisible again. And there I was, standing, with the warm air of a regained home, understanding that sometimes freedom isn't won by leaving, but by staying. Before going to bed, I passed through the hallway and saw her bedroom door open. Inside, the bed made, curtains moving with the breeze. I stood still a moment, watching that open frame. I remembered the first night, the latch, the tape, the keys hidden in my pocket. I felt neither guilt nor pride. I felt justice. Not the court's or God's justice, but the kind of acts that teach without needing punishment. In the garage, the blanket was still folded on the chair. I touched it, ran my hand over it, as if petting a sleeping animal. It was my amulet and my warning, proof that even the coldest spaces can become refuge if you learn to endure silence. I sat there a while, listening to the house's distant echo. Upstairs, Lucy's steps were soft, almost timid. Julian shut the study door, the TV went off, and the building settled into a peace that needed no explanation. I thought of old age, how they push you bit by bit into corners until one day you decide to stand in the center, even if it bothers people. I thought of my husband, what he would have said if he saw me, now, and I smiled. He'd probably have said one of his dry lines, "You finally claimed your space, Karen." When I went up, before bed, I turned off the hallway lights. The house went dark, except for the light coming in from the living room window. I ran my hand along the wall, feeling the rough paint, every mark, every crack, every little testimony to lives that had passed there. I stopped in front of the open room, looked at it one last time and closed my eyes. I felt the warm air, the smell of soap, the stillness. I don't know how long I stayed like that, standing, breathing, maybe seconds, maybe a century. But when I finally moved and went back to my room, I knew everything had changed forever. Not because the door was open or because of the apologies, but because that night I slept without fear of waking up in the garage, and that, for a woman like me, was worth more than any forgiveness. The last dawn arrived without warning, with a different shine, almost unrecognizable. It wasn't the light that woke me, but the smell of toast and melting butter, that old aroma that used to fill my kitchen when my son was little and I still believed love was proven by making breakfast. I lay there a moment, listening to the soft sounds from upstairs, the clinking cutlery, the coffee maker's murmur, the cupboard door opening and closing. For a second, I didn't know what house I was in. It took me a few seconds to remember it wasn't my house, but that for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like a stranger. I went up slowly, unhurried, body still warm with sleep. The staircase smelled of soap and bread. In the kitchen, Lucy stood with her back to me, hair up, the blue robe she used to wear only on Sundays, and a new serenity in her gestures. She turned just enough when she heard me and smiled, a short but real smile, without artifice. I made coffee, she said, like someone offering truce without asking for anything. I can smell it, I replied, and sat down. On the table, there were 3 cups, 3 plates, 3 napkins folded with care. Julian hadn't come down yet. The air had a different weight, lighter. It was strange to feel peace after so much noise. A part of me feared it was just a pause, a fragile calm before another tremor. But no. There was something deeper, a silent decision never to cross that line again. She poured the coffee. I slept well, she told me, without looking. I hadn't slept like that in a long time. Sleep is capricious. It only comes when you stop fighting it. I suppose I deserved it, she murmured. It's not about deserving. Sometimes you just have to surrender. We stayed quiet a while. I listened to the coffee maker's slow drip, the crunch of bread, the held breath that goes with important conversations. We didn't need to talk about the lock-in. That chapter was already written in our looks. I knew she understood, and she knew I bore no grudges. It was a wordless pact, like the ones old soldiers make after war. You don't ask who fired first, you just clean the field and bury the dead. Julian came down, sleepy, a trace of disbelief, as if seeing us sharing coffee was an impossible scene. He watched us from the doorway, and I knew he was holding back a smile. "Can I sit? Or is this a women's meeting?" he joked. "If you bring the toast, you can," Lucy answered, and her tone was so natural that he stood frozen a second, surprised. We had breakfast in peace. The sound of spoons against cups was almost musical. There were small, timid laughs that grew more confident little by little. At one point, Julian told a story from work, and she interrupted him with a burst of laughter. I watched her, the way she covered her mouth, the naturalness of the gesture. She was another woman, or maybe the same one without the armor. When we finished, Lucy started clearing the table, and I helped. Our movements intertwined without tripping, as if we'd rehearsed that choreography for years. Julian, leaning on the doorframe, watched us with tenderness. And seeing him, I thought all of this, the garage, the keys, the lock-in had been for him too. Not to punish him, but to show him that family is not held together by sweet words, but by balance. She left the plates in the sink and stood a moment watching the water run. "I've been thinking," she said, "about everything that happened. I don't know how to explain it, but I feel I needed to stop, to look at what I was doing." "Sometimes life stops you short," I answered, "so you learn to be still without everything falling apart." She nodded, and in that gesture there was no shame but acceptance. We went out together to the balcony. The air smelled of wet earth and bread. The courtyard trees shone after the rain. We stood there, looking without speaking. I don't know how long passed, but it was enough to understand that forgiveness, when it comes, makes no noise. It's a breeze that brushes over you and leaves you different without you noticing. "I've been thinking about your room," she said, eyes still on the courtyard. "If you want, I can help you bring your things up. You don't have to sleep in the garage." I didn't expect to hear it, though I had wished it. "Thank you," I said, "but I'll stay one more night downstairs. I like the silence there. It reminds me I'm still alive." She smiled. She didn't insist. That was her way of respecting me. In the afternoon, Julian took me to the market. We walked slowly, like 2 old accomplices. He didn't talk much, but his silences were different, more attentive, more tender. We bought fruit, bread, flowers. When we came back, Lucy had put on soft music and the house smelled of soup. I laughed inside. Soup, always soup. As if in the end, everything that matters in life could be summed up in a hot bowl shared. We had an early dinner. No one mentioned the past. After, she brought out a bottle of wine and poured 3 glasses. "To peace," she said, raising hers. "To sanity," I added. "To you too," Julian finished. We toasted. The clink of the glasses was a clean sound, like a perfect closing. We spoke little after that, each going to our room with the lightness left by endings set right. I went down to the garage one last time before bed. I opened the door, turned on the light, and the cold air brushed my face. The boxes were where I'd left them, the car still, the past's echo on the walls. I went to the blanket, folded it slowly, and put it in a box. I wouldn't need it anymore, but I wanted to keep it. Objects that saw us suffer deserve a corner, not from nostalgia, but respect. I climbed the stairs slowly, listening to every wood creak, every breath of the house. Before reaching the hallway, I stopped. Lucy's bedroom door was ajar, a strip of yellow light slipping onto the floor. I peeked for just a second. She was sitting on the bed, reading. She saw me, and instead of being uncomfortable, she smiled. "Good night, Karen. Good night, Lucy." I went to my room. I closed the door, sat on the bed, and looked out the window. Outside, the sky was clear, the moon round, huge. I thought of everything that had happened, how something as small as a closed door had managed to put back in order everything that was out of place. And I understood that life, sometimes, is corrected with minimal gestures, measured silences, the courage to stand firm when others walk away. I turned off the light. I lay down. The air had that new smell the rain leaves behind when it cleans what nobody dared to touch. I closed my eyes with a smile. It wasn't happiness I felt. It was something more solid, more serene. The certainty of having recovered my place without shouting. And before I fell asleep, I thought that, in the end, justice and love aren't enemies. They're more alike than we think. Both need limits, patience, and time. And that sometimes, to recover peace, it's enough to close a door and have the courage to open it afterwards. And that's how my story ended, for now. I'd love to know what you would have done in my place open earlier, or wait a little longer. Tell me in the comments. I want to read you. And if you like stories that feel real, subscribe. What's coming next will surprise you.